May I share with you my deepest regret? A simple request that I brushed aside, words I didn't understand the importance of until it was too late. It seems like such a small thing. 3 brief sentences, spoken on an ordinary evening. But those words have become the ghost that haunts my days and the regret that fills my nights. My name is Alex. I'm 33. And this story begins on a crisp autumn evening in upstate New York, with the scent of wood smoke hanging in the air and leaves crunching beneath our feet as my grandfather and I walked slowly around the perimeter of the small lake on his property. Grandpa William had always been larger than life to me, a former English professor with a booming voice perfect for reciting poetry, hands permanently ink-stained from decades of grading papers, eyes that crinkled at the corners when he laughed. Even at 87, there was a vigor about him that belied his age, a sharpness of mind that remained untouched by the years that had gradually bent his one straight spine. I was visiting for the weekend, a trip I made every few months from my apartment in Brooklyn, as often as I should have. A fact that weighs heavier now than it did then. The 3-hour drive always felt like crossing a threshold between worlds. From the constant hum of city life to the profound quiet of my grandfather's 10 acres of woods and water. That particular visit was in late October, when the maple trees had turned brilliant shades of red and gold, their reflected colors dancing on the lake's surface as the setting sun painted everything in honey-colored light. Grandpa had insisted on our evening walk, despite the growing chill, waving away my concerns about the darkening sky. The best conversations happen in twilight, he'd said, reaching for his worn tweed jacket. Something about the fading light makes truth easier to speak. We walked in comfortable silence for a while, him leaning slightly on my arm when the path grew uneven. I'd been telling him about my recent promotion at the architectural firm where I worked, about the stress of managing my first major project, about the endless meetings and revisions and client demands. "You sound tired, Alex," he observed, his voice gentle but direct in that way. He had cutting immediately to the heart of things. Make sure you're not becoming a stranger to yourself in the pursuit of success. It was the kind of quietly profound statement he often made, the wisdom earned through nearly 9 decades of living. In my younger years, I'd hung on such observations, writing them down in journals I still kept. But lately, busy with building my career and my own life, I'd grown less attentive to his philosophical offerings. "I'm fine," I assured him, with the casual dismissiveness of someone who believes time is an endless resource. "Just busy. It'll calm down after this project launches." He nodded, though something in his expression suggested he heard the hollow promise in my words. We continued around the lake, pausing occasionally for him to point out a particularly beautiful reflection, or to identify a bird call drifting through the trees. As we neared the old wooden dock where his small rowboat was tied, he stopped suddenly, his hand tightening on my arm. "I've been having the strangest dreams lately," he said, his eyes on the darkening water. "About your grandmother, mostly. So vivid, I can smell her perfume when I wake up." I nodded, unsure how to respond. Grandma Catherine had been gone for 12 years, but her absence remained a palpable thing in the lakeside house they had shared for over 5 decades. "She's always just as she was when we first met," he continued, a smile softening his features. "Young and full of fire, arguing with me about poetry or politics or whatever we disagreed about that day." "That sounds nice," I offered lamely, uncomfortable with the sudden vulnerability. Grief was not a subject we discussed often, it simply existed between us, acknowledged but rarely examined directly. "It is," he agreed. "But that's not what I wanted to tell you." He turned to face me fully, something urgent in his gaze that I'd rarely seen before. The fading light caught the silver of his hair, the deep lines around his eyes, the slight tremble in his usually steady hands. "I need you to do something for me, Alex," he said, his voice taking on a formality that felt out of place in our typically easy relationship. "Something important." "Of course, Grandpa," I replied automatically. "Anything. Record my voice," he said simply. "I want you to have it, after. When I'm reading poetry, or telling those old stories you used to love. I want you to be able to hear me, even when I'm not here anymore." The request caught me off guard. Grandpa William had never been sentimental in this way, had never spoken so directly about his eventual absence. Something about it made me deeply uncomfortable, as if acknowledging the possibility would somehow accelerate its arrival. "Remember my voice," he continued, his gaze still locked with mine. "I dream about you every night. I want you to have something to hold on to." I shifted awkwardly, forcing a small laugh to dispel the sudden heaviness. "You're being morbid, Grandpa. You'll be around for years yet." He didn't laugh in return, didn't soften his expression. "Just promise me you'll do it. This weekend, before you go back to the city." "Sure," I said, already mentally dismissing the request as the momentary melancholy of an old man at twilight. "We can do that, but right now, it's getting cold and dark. We should head back to the house." He allowed me to guide him back toward the path, his momentary intensity fading as we discussed what to have for dinner and whether the Yankees had any chance at next season. By the time we reached the warmth and light of the kitchen, the conversation by the lake felt distant, almost dreamlike in the contrast between twilight vulnerability and the practical reality of heating leftover stew and slicing bread. We spent the evening, as we always did during my visits, him in his leather armchair by the fire, me on the couch nearby, the shelves of books surrounding us like old friends. He read aloud from Whitman and Frost, his voice rising and falling with the familiar cadence that had shaped my earliest understanding of language. I listened with half my attention, the other half on my phone as I answered work emails and checked social media. At one point, I glanced up to find him watching me, a complex emotion in his eyes that I couldn't quite interpret. He didn't say anything, just returned to his book with a small sigh that carried more weight than words could have. The next morning brought rain, the cold, steady downpour of late autumn that turns fallen leaves to slick, colorful carpets and mists, the windows with condensation. We stayed indoors, Grandpa working on the crossword puzzle that was his Sunday ritual, me catching up on work I'd brought from the city. When the time came for me to leave, the rain had tapered to a gentle drizzle. I packed my overnight bag and loaded it into my car while Grandpa watched from the porch, a cardigan buttoned against the damp chill. "Don't forget what I asked you," he said as I hugged him goodbye. "About recording my voice." I nodded, already mentally calculating the traffic I might hit on the drive back to Brooklyn. "Next time," I promised, "I'll bring proper equipment. We'll do it right." Something like resignation passed across his face, so quickly I might have imagined it. "Next time," he echoed softly. "I'll call when I get home," I said, sliding into the driver's seat. "Maybe Wednesday, when I'm not so swamped with meetings." "I'd like that," he replied, raising a hand in farewell as I backed down the long driveway. In my rearview mirror, I caught a final glimpse of him standing on the porch of the lakeside house, small and solitary against the weathered wood, a figure from another time watching me return to mine. I called on Wednesday as promised, our conversation brief but pleasant. I didn't mention his request about recording his voice, nor did he bring it up again. We talked about my work, about the book he was reading, about the weather turning colder. Ordinary things, the kind that filled the spaces between meaningful conversations, the daily currency of relationships maintained across distance. 2 weeks later, on a gray Tuesday morning, my phone rang as I was rushing out the door to a client meeting. My mother's name on the screen. "Can I call you back?" I answered without greeting. "I'm heading into a meeting that I can't be late for." "Alex," she said, her voice carrying a weight that stopped me in my tracks. "It's Grandpa." The world narrowed to a single point to focus her voice in my ear. The sudden hollowness in my chest, the knowledge that crashed into me before she even spoke the words. "He went in his sleep," she continued, her voice breaking slightly. "Peaceful," the doctor said. Heart simply stopped. I stood frozen in my apartment doorway, keys in hand, unable to process what she was saying. Just 2 weeks since I'd seen him. Just 5 days since our last phone call. It wasn't possible. There had been no warning, no illness, no reason to think our time was running short, except there had been. "Record my voice. I want you to have it after, when I'm not here anymore. Remember my voice. I dream about you every night." He had known somehow, had tried to tell me in his way, had asked for one simple thing that would have given me the comfort of his voice after he could no longer speak himself, and I hadn't listened, hadn't recorded a single word, hadn't even recognized the importance of what he was asking. Next time, I had promised, but there would be no next time, no chance to sit beside him with a recorder as he read poetry, or told stories, or simply spoke about his day. No opportunity to preserve the voice that had narrated my childhood, that had taught me the power of words, that had always been my definition of wisdom and warmth. In the days that followed the funeral arrangements, the gathering of family, the sorting through of his belongings, searched desperately for any recording of his voice. Surely somewhere in the digital detritus of modern life, there must be a voicemail, a video clip, something that captured the distinctive timbre and rhythm of Grandpa William's speech. But there was nothing. He had been of a generation that viewed phones as functional devices rather than constant companions and documentarians. He had never been on social media, never engaged in the endless self-recording that characterizes contemporary existence. The few family videos we had were ancient VHS tapes from before my birth, their audio quality degraded beyond recognition. The voice that had been so fundamental to my understanding of the world, reading stories, explaining concepts, offering quiet wisdom, existed now only in memory. A memory that I knew would fade with time, losing its distinctive qualities until I could no longer hear it clearly in my mind. The evening of the funeral, I stood alone on the dock where we had had our last meaningful conversation. The lake was perfectly still, a mirror reflecting the rising moon and scattered stars. In the profound silence of that moment, I strained to hear his voice in my memory, trying to recall exactly how he pronounced certain words, the precise timbre of his laugh, the way his tone changed when he was reciting poetry versus telling a story. Already, just 2 weeks after hearing him speak for the last time, I found the details beginning to blur. Remember my voice. He had warned me, in his way, had perhaps sensed what was coming, through whatever intuition comes to those nearing the end of long lives, had tried to leave me with something tangible to hold on to. And I, distracted by the trivial urgencies of my busy life, had dismissed his request, had promised next time when no such time would come. The warning was there, the opportunity was offered, and I didn't listen. Now, instead of his recorded voice reading Whitman, or telling stories, or simply saying my name with the affection that always colored ETI, have only silence, and the haunting echo of words I refused to preserve. 547 nights have passed since my grandfather left this world. 547 opportunities to dream of him, as he once dreamed of me. That's how I've come to mark time, not in days or weeks or months, but in nights. Because night is when I search for him most desperately, when I strain to catch the fading echo of his voice in the corridors of memory and dreams. I dream about you every night, he told me on that twilight walk around the lake. Words I barely acknowledged then, but which have become central to my existence now. Each evening, as I drift toward sleep, I silently invite him to visit my dreams, to speak to me in the only way still possible. Sometimes, he does. Not every night, not even most nights, but often enough to sustain me. Dreams where he sits in his leather chair by the fire, book open on his lap. Dreams where we walk the perimeter of the lake, fallen leaves crunching beneath our feet. Dreams where he looks at me with those clear blue eyes and says things I strain to remember upon waking. But even in dreams, his voice remains just beyond my grasp, present enough to recognize, but too indistinct to retain. I wake with the sensation of having heard him speak, but unable to recall the exact sound, the particular cadence, the unique way he pronounced certain words. 3 months after the funeral, I moved out of my Brooklyn apartment and into my grandfather's lakeside house. My mother had been surprised by my decision to leave the city, to take a remote position with my architectural firm, to transplant my life to the quiet countryside I had previously visited only occasionally. "Are you sure this is what you want?" she'd asked, concern evident in her voice. "It's so isolated up there, especially in winter." "I'm sure," I'd replied, unable to fully articulate why it felt so necessary. How could I explain that I needed to be surrounded by his books, his furniture, his world? That I hoped proximity to the spaces where his voice had once resonated might somehow help me preserve what remained of it in my memory. The first winter was the hardest, not because of the isolation my mother feared, but because of the constant reminders of absence. Every room held echoes of Grandpa William's presence. His reading glasses still rested on the side table next to his chair. His collection of fountain pens remained arranged precisely on his desk. His wool sweaters hung in the closet, still carrying the faint scent of pipe tobacco, though he'd given up smoking years before. I left everything as it was, unable to pack away these physical extensions of the man I'd lost. The house became a sort of living museum, with me as both curator and sole visitor, preserving a life that had ended while trying to extract meaning from its arranged artifacts. During that first winter, I developed rituals. Each evening, I would sit in his chair by the fire, never my own chair, always his, and read aloud from one of his books, Whitman, Frost, Thoreau. All the voices that had shaped his worldview, and, through him, my own. I would record myself reading, then play it back, trying to adjust my inflection and rhythm to match my memory of how he would have read the same passages. The recordings were a poor substitute, of course. My voice lacks the depth and resonance that characterized his, the weight of experience that gave his reading such authority. But the practice became a form of connection, a way of keeping his words, if not his exact voiceal, live in the quiet house. Spring brought the first anniversary of our last visit together. The weekend by the lake, when he had made his request, and I had promised next time. I marked the occasion by finally doing what he had asked, setting up professional recording equipment in the living room, and spending hours reading aloud from his favorite works, telling stories about him, recording one-sided conversations, as if he might somehow hear my belated response. Too late, of course. Monumentally, heartbreakingly, too late. But necessary nonetheless, a gesture toward the promise I had failed to keep when it mattered. As spring melted into summer, I found myself spending more time by the lake, often sitting on the dock where we'd had our final meaningful exchange. One evening, as twilight painted the water in shades of purple and gold, I noticed an elderly man walking slowly along the opposite shore, his slight figure silhouetted against the setting sun, his deliberate pace reminiscent of my grandfather's careful steps. For one irrational moment, my heart leaped with impossible hope. Then reality reasserted itself, and I recognized him as Mr. Peterson, my grandfather's longtime neighbor and occasional fishing companion. He spotted me on the dock and raised a hand in greeting, altering his path to make his way around the lake, toward me. By the time he arrived, full darkness had nearly fallen, the first stars reflecting in the still water. "Thought that might be you," he said, settling heavily beside me on the weathered planks. "Been meaning to come by since I heard you'd moved in, but didn't want to intrude on your grieving." I assured him he wasn't intruding, grateful for human contact after weeks of relative solitude. We sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the chorus of frogs and insects that marked the arrival of summer evenings. "Your grandfather was a remarkable man," Mr. Peterson said finally. "Not just for his intelligence, though he had that in spades, but for his attention. The way he listened made you feel like whatever you were saying was the most important thing he'd ever heard." I nodded, throat tight with sudden emotion. It was precisely this quality I had failed to offer when it mattered most to full attention. The recognition of importance beneath seemingly ordinary exchanges. "He talked about you all the time," Mr. Peterson continued, his voice gentle in the gathering darkness. "So proud of your accomplishments, your talent. Kept every article about buildings you'd worked on, every mention of your firm in the papers." This was news to me. Grandpa William had always been supportive of my career, but I hadn't realized he'd followed it so closely from his rural retirement. Collected evidence of my professional life, while I was too busy living it to call as often as I should have. "Did he ever mention dreams to you?" I asked suddenly, about my grandmother, or about me. Mr. Peterson was quiet for a moment, considering. "He did, actually. Couple months before he passed. Said he'd been having the most vivid dreams, felt more real than waking life sometimes. Said your grandmother was visiting him regularly, that they were having the conversations they'd had when they first met." He paused, gazing out over the dark water. "And he mentioned dreaming about you too. Said it made him happy, seeing you in his sleep when your busy life kept you away otherwise. No bitterness in it, just acceptance, understanding. That was William's way." A familiar ache spread through my chest, equal parts love and regret. Even in his dreams, my grandfather had been generous, had understood what I had not. That absence isn't always a choice. That connection persists beyond physical proximity. That love transcends the limitations of time and space. But still, I had failed him in that one simple request. Still, I had no recording of his voice, no way to hear him speak except in dreams that dissolved upon waking, and memories that grew less distinct with each passing day. I miss hearing him talk, I admitted, the words carrying more weight than they might appear to. The particular way he had of explaining things, of reading poetry. I'm afraid I'm forgetting it already. Mr. Peterson nodded slowly. Voices are like that, hard to hold on to in memory. That's why he stopped himself, a strange expression crossing his weathered face. "Actually, I just remembered something. Wait here a moment." He rose with some difficulty and made his way back along the shore, disappearing into the darkness. I remained on the dock, puzzled by his abrupt departure, but willing to wait, as requested. 20 minutes later, he returned, a small object clutched carefully in his gnarled hand. "Found it," he said, settling beside me again. "Knew I still had it somewhere." He handed me what appeared to be an old cassette tape, its plastic case cracked at one corner. A handwritten label, faded but still legible. William Lake Readings. Summer 2018. Your grandfather used to host these informal poetry evenings on his porch during the summers, Mr. Peterson explained. Nothing fancy, just neighbors gathering to hear him read from his favorite works. My wife recorded one of them before she passed. Always meant to give him a copy, but one thing led to another, and, well, time gets away from us all. My hands trembled as I held the cassette, this unexpected artifact containing what I had believed lost forever. "Does it?" is the quality. "It's amateur," he admitted. "Recorded on an old boombox, lots of background noise, cicadas, wind, people shifting in their chairs. But his voice comes through clear as day, especially when he reads Whitman. You know how he'd always sit up straighter, speak with more force for Walt." I did know. Could picture it perfectly. The slight adjustment of posture, the deepening of tone, the more deliberate pacing he adopted for his favorite poet. And now, incredibly, I might hear it again, not just in fading memory, but in actual reality. "I can't," I began, emotion choking off my words. "I don't know how to thank you for this." Mr. Peterson waved away my gratitude. "No need. He'd want you to have it. Only wish I'd remembered it sooner." That night, after Mr. Peterson had gone home, and the lake lay silent under a canopy of stars, I faced a new challenge, finding something capable of playing a cassette tape in a world that had largely abandoned such technology. After searching through closets and storage spaces, I finally discovered an old boombox similar to the one that had recorded the tape, tucked away in a guest room closet. My hands shook as I inserted the cassette, the plastic mechanism creaking with disuse. I hesitated before pressing play, suddenly afraid that the tape would be damaged, that the recording would be unintelligible, that the quality would be too poor to capture the nuances that made my grandfather's voice uniquely his. Or worse, that it would be perfect, and the contrast between having his voice preserved and having failed to preserve it myself would be too painful to bear. Finally, steeling myself, I pressed the button. At first, there was only static, and my heart sank. Then, emerging through the background noise, like a ship appearing through fog, I heard it the unmistakable timbre, the precise cadence, the warm authority that could only belong to Grandpa William. "We shall begin with Whitman," his voice announced, as clear and present as if he were in the room with me. "A song of myself, a work that continues to reveal new meanings with each reading, even after all these years." A brief rustling of pages, then the voice again, deeper now, more measured, taking on the slight rhythmic quality he always adopted for poetry. "I celebrate myself, and sing myself, and what I assume you shall assume, for every atom belonging to me, as good belongs to you." I sank to the floor, back against the wall, as the familiar words washed over me and the voice I had feared lost forever. Tears flowed freely down my face, not just grief now, but a complex mixture of relief, gratitude, and lingering regret. For nearly an hour, I sat motionless as my grandfather's voice filled the quiet house reading Whitman, then Frost, then Oliver, interspersed with brief commentary and occasional laughter from the unseen audience. The recording captured everything, the slight tremor that entered his voice during particularly moving passages, the thoughtful pauses he employed for emphasis, the gentle humor that colored his introductions to each poet. When the tape finally clicked to a stop, the sudden silence felt like a physical presence. I sat in the darkness, overwhelmed by the gift I had been given, this unexpected preservation of what I had believed irretrievably lost. Yet alongside gratitude ran a current of sharper emotion, the knowledge that I could have had so much more. Not just poetry readings, but personal messages, stories about his life that I had heard fragments of, but never in full. Wisdom he might have chosen to impart directly to me, rather than these words written by others and directed to a general audience. I had been offered that opportunity, had been asked directly to create exactly such a recording, and had dismissed it as unnecessary, something that could wait for next time. The cassette became my most treasured possession. I carefully transferred it to digital format, creating multiple backups to protect against loss or degradation. I listened to it daily at first, then weekly as time passed, rationing the experience to prevent it from becoming too familiar, from losing its power to conjure his presence. Summer turned to fall, a full year of seasons completed since his passing. On the anniversary of that last weekend visit, I sat on the dock at twilight. Portable speaker beside me, playing his voice over the still waters of the lake. Poetry, his recorded voice declared, is humanity's attempt to capture the ineffable, to give shape to the shapeless, to make permanent what is by nature transient. Words about impermanence, spoken by a voice now made artificially permanent through technology. The irony wasn't lost on me, nor was the deeper truth that no recording, however clear, could capture the full reality of the person who had spoken. The way his eyes would crinkle at certain phrases, the specific angle of his head when listening to someone's response, the warmth of his hand on my shoulder, these remained beyond technology's reach, preserved only in increasingly unreliable memory. As autumn deepened toward winter, I began having dreams of my own, vivid, startling dreams, in which my grandfather appeared not as I had last seen him, slightly stooped and silver-haired, but as a young man in his 30s, vibrant and dark-haired, with the same blue eyes but fewer lines surrounding them. In these dreams, we would walk together through landscapes that merged his lakeside property with places from my own life. City streets would open suddenly onto forest paths. Office buildings would contain his book-lined study. Subway platforms would become wooden docks, extending into familiar waters. And in these dreams, unlike my waking attempts to recall his voice, I could hear him perfectly, each inflection, each distinctive pronunciation, each subtle shift in tone that conveyed meaning beyond the words themselves. We would have conversations impossible in life, spanning time and space, wisdom flowing not just from him to me, but in both directions. One night, in a dream more vivid than any before it, we sat together on the dock as a spectacular sunset painted the western sky. But unlike reality, where I had been distracted and dismissive during our last sunset together, in this dream I was fully present, attentive to each word, each gesture, each meaning. I've been trying to hear your voice, I told him. I found a recording poetry readings from a few years ago. He smiled, his expression knowing. And does it comfort you, this preserved echo? Yes, I admitted. But it's not enough. I should have recorded you when you asked. Should have understood what you were trying to tell me. And what was I trying to tell you, Alex? He asked, his gaze direct and penetrating in that way he had of cutting immediately to the heart of things. That you were leaving, I said, the words painful, even in a dream. That our time was running out. That I needed to pay attention to what mattered. He considered this, looking out over the dream lake that reflected impossible colors. Perhaps, he said finally, or perhaps I was trying to tell you something else entirely. What? I asked, desperate for whatever wisdom he might offer, even in this illusory form. That preservation isn't the point, he said simply. That recording, remembering, holding on, these are poor substitutes for truly hearing while there's still time to listen. I woke with tears on my face, his words still echoing in my mind with perfect clarity. Preservation isn't the point. Truly hearing while there's still time to listen. Words that existed nowhere in reality, not on any recording, not in any book or letter he had left behind. Words created by my own unconscious, perhaps, yet carrying a truth that felt authentic to the grandfather I had known and lost. That morning, I sat at his desk now. My desk hand began to write. Not to him this time, but about him. About his life as I had known it. The lessons he had taught me, the values he had embodied. About the way he listened, truly listened to everyone he encountered. Offering the gift of his complete attention in a world increasingly structured around distraction. As the words flowed, I realized I was doing more than preserving memories. I was actively engaging with his legacy, allowing it to shape my present rather than simply mourning its absence from my past. I was, in a sense, continuing our conversation, not through supernatural visitation or technological preservation, but through the ongoing influence of his life on mine. 2 years have now passed since that twilight walk around the lake. 2 years of nights in which I have sometimes found him in dreams and sometimes searched for him in vain. 2 years of gradually adjusting to an absence that never becomes normal but slowly grows more bearable. I still listen to the recording regularly, his voice reading beloved poems, a gift I never take for granted. But I've stopped expecting it to fill the void completely, to satisfy the hunger for connection that only truly attentive presence can provide. Instead, I've tried to learn from my failure to become the kind of listener my grandfather was, to offer others the complete attention I withheld from him when it mattered most. To recognize that no future interaction is guaranteed, that next time is always a hope rather than a certainty. Last month, I received an unexpected email from a former colleague and architect I had worked with briefly before moving to the lake house. Her father was dying, she wrote. He had expressed interest in the kind of natural lakeside burial that was becoming increasingly popular. Would I be willing to consult on designing a small memorial structure on their rural property? My first instinct was to decline. I had largely stepped back from architectural work, focusing instead on writing a book about my grandfather, part memoir, part philosophical exploration of attention and presence in an age of distraction. The project this woman proposed would require travel, would interrupt my writing schedule, would pull me away from the lake where I felt closest to Grandpa William. But as I began composing a polite refusal, his voice, not the recorded one, but the internal echo that guides my decisions, now seemed to whisper, "Preservation isn't the point. Truly hearing while there's still time to listen." I deleted my half-written response and began again, accepting the commission and suggesting we meet the following week. The project took me away from the lake house for nearly a month, designing not just a memorial structure but helping this woman and her father create a space where grief and memory could coexist with beauty and ongoing life. We worked closely together, this dying man and I, finding unexpected common ground in our experiences of loss and preservation. One evening, as we sat reviewing sketches on his porch, he mentioned almost casually that he had been recording messages for his daughter and grandchildren's stories from his life. Advice he hoped they might find useful, expressions of love he wanted preserved beyond his physical presence. "It gives me comfort," he explained, "knowing they'll still be able to hear my voice after I'm gone." I nodded, sharing with him the story of my grandfather's request and my failure to fulfill it. "You're giving them a precious gift," I told him. "One I wish I had given my grandfather when I had the chance." He was quiet for a moment, considering. "Perhaps," he said finally, "but I think the greater gift might be what you're doing now, being fully present with a stranger at the end of his life, listening to his ideas, helping create something that matters to him. That kind of attention is rarer than any recording." His words, so reminiscent of what my dream grandfather had told me, struck deeply. Was it possible that the lesson I needed to learn wasn't about preservation at all, but about presence? Not about holding on to the past, but about fully inhabiting each moment as it occurs. When I returned to the lake house after completing the memorial project, I brought these questions with me. The analog quality of life by the water where internet service remains spotty in cell. Reception unreliable had already slowed my pace, had already made me more attentive to the natural world and its rhythms. But now I began consciously practicing the kind of deep listening my grandfather had exemplified, not just with people, but with all aspects of existence. I listened to the changing voices of the lake through seasons, the crack and groan of winter ice, the gentle lapping of spring thaw, the summer chorus of insects and birds, the melancholy whisper of autumn wind through nearly bare branches. I listened to the stories of neighbors who had known my grandfather for decades, collecting memories I had never heard, perspectives I had never considered, and most importantly, I listened to the silence, the absence that had initially driven me to desperate preservation efforts but which now offered its own form of communication. In that silence, I began to hear what could not be captured in recordings or preserved through technology, the ongoing conversation between what my grandfather had been and what I was becoming. Last night, on the 3rd anniversary of his passing, I dreamed of him again. We walked the perimeter of the lake, just as we had on that last evening together, but this time I was fully present, attentive to each word, each gesture, each meaning beneath the surface of our exchange. "You asked me to record your voice," I said in the dream, regret still coloring the words despite all I had learned. I didn't understand how important it was. "And now," he asked, his blue eyes crinkling at the corners in that familiar way, "do you understand now?" I considered the question carefully before answering, wanting to honor the complexity of what these years of grief and growth had taught me. "I think," I said slowly, "that you weren't really asking me to preserve your voice for after you were gone. You were asking me to truly hear it while you were still here, to be present, to pay attention, to recognize the value of what was being offered before it was lost." He smiled, that warm, slightly crooked smile that no recording could ever fully capture. "You always were a quick study, Alex, just sometimes a bit delayed in your understanding." I laughed, the sound echoing across the dream lake with a freedom I rarely felt in waking life. Better late than never. Much better, he agreed, his expression sobering slightly. And what will you do with this understanding? The question lingered as I woke, following me into consciousness like a task left unfinished. What would I do with this understanding? How would it shape my choices, my relationships, my way of moving through the world? The answer came not in words, but in action, in the decision to call my mother, not later, but immediately, to listen fully to her concerns about her own aging, to offer the gift of complete attention rather than distracted half-presence, in the choice to accept an invitation to speak at a local high school about architecture and writing, professions built around different forms of listening, in the daily practice of sitting on the dock at twilight, neither frantically preserving experiences nor distracting myself from them, but simply being present as the day transforms into night. The recording of my grandfather's voice remains precious to me, a tangible connection to what has been lost, a reminder of the specific cadence and timbre that made his speech uniquely his. I still listen to it regularly, still find comfort in the familiar patterns of his poetry readings, but I no longer expect technology to provide what only presence can offer. I no longer believe that preservation is an adequate substitute for attention. I no longer mistake the container for the essence it once held. Remember my voice, he said on that last evening together. I dream about you every night. I didn't record his voice when it mattered, didn't recognize the importance of what he was asking, didn't understand the warning beneath the request. But perhaps, in my slow and imperfect way, I am finally learning to hear what he was really trying to tell me. That the conversation continues not through artificial preservation, but through attentive living. That his voice echoes not just in recordings or dreams or memories, but in the choices I make, the attention I offer, the presence I bring to each irreplaceable moment. He warned me, and initially I didn't listen. But perhaps true listening is not confined to a single opportunity. Perhaps it extends across time and absence, across mistakes and corrections, across all the ways we continue to grow in response to those who shaped us, even when they are no longer here to see who we are becoming. Narrated by Alex, 33, who lost his grandfather William.